And welcome back to the Justin Thurber Show. I'm Justin Thurber, and as always, my co-host extraordinaire, Jim Davidson. How are we doing today, Jim?
Doing good. Thanks for having me.
So this week we have a special guest. His name's Dan FitzGerald. It was this week you had contacted me and said you met this amazing guy, and he's on the board of register of voters in Massachusetts. And I kind of sat there for a second. I'm like, board of registrars? I'm like, are people really gonna want to watch a show about this? And then when we got discussing what they do, his experiences, I said, oh my gosh, we definitely have to have him on. So without further ado, let us get Dan FitzGerald on. How are you doing today, Dan?
I'm doing great, Justin. Thank you. Hi, Jim.
Good, good. Well, welcome to the show. First off, I just would like to ask you, what led you to seek out to be on the board of registrars, and what do they do? Kind of two-part question.
Yeah, so I think initially I was retired, so then it was like, hey, try to maybe give back to the town or get involved in some sort of government body with regards to the town, a committee or a board. So that was the first piece. And then the election piece was interesting to me, not knowing much about elections, how they really worked outside of just being a voter. So both of those pieces were really what drove me to say, and there was an opening. There happened to be an opening in my town government with regards to it. So, that just they all blended in to say, hey, I should do that. So I did.
Well, the interesting thing I found out, because again, I think a lot of people know a lot about politics and how it works, but I think there's so vast and so many different things that I didn't have an understanding of what the registrar does, and how they're selected. And it was funny when you were talking to us early this week, you explained that you were unenrolled, and can you explain that a little bit more about how the roles are determined, who selects the people, or how it's supposed to be selected for this position, and how you got into it and were selected, and do you need any special skills or?
Yeah, no, you don't need special skills. So for me, as an unenrolled, as I say, for us, there was an opening, and I just put in through the regular process of anyone in Grafton that would get on a board or a committee. The things with the registrars, though, they are regulated by political affiliation. So typically what's supposed to happen is, and what probably did happen in my case anyway, is that the town clerk will put out a letter to both the two main parties, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, to see if they have candidates in their group, in their committees, that would like to be registrars. So I put my application having nothing to do with either of those things in as a candidate, and I was told, hey, you're the only one so far, but I believe my town clerk did a due diligence and checked with both the other town committees, and they didn't forward any names to be appointed. So as a result of that, by default, I was, as an unenrolled voter, I was allowed to take the position that was open.
That's awesome. Default, right? So here's something I'm just pulling up on the screen right now. So actually, if you do a Google search of registrars and their duties, it's actually, there's a lot of duties they have, and it's funny because when I was in the Air Force, a lot of people used to sit there and like, all these people over there do is this, like the clinic, all they do is this, or if it's the services people who made the food, all they do is make our food. And I used to tell people, I'm like, no, they do a lot more. The Air Force didn't make jobs for a person to do one thing, right? And it's the same thing in politics. I think a lot of times, like, oh, you're a registrar and all you do is this, and it's actually pretty involved. So I'm going to read through a couple of the duties that the registrars have, and then we can discuss how they've affected you and what you've done, if you've done these all or some of them. So they maintain accurate lists of registered voters in the town. They conduct elections. They accept nomination papers. They certify initiatives on referendum petitions, voter registration. Oh, let's stop there and let's see, because I know you're probably sitting there like, that's a lot of stuff. So have you had to do, when you conduct elections or whatever, I know we discussed it, you can't technically be involved, if I'm remembering correctly, like you can't technically be involved unless there's an issue.
Right. So, so for my town, the website had a lot of things in there that basically after a month, I realized we don't really do, whether it was what they used to do in the past as a registrar. But so as far as conducting elections, I was interested in that. I said, hey, can I go to the election? My first, right, here we go, right? We're going to have election in May. And it's like, hey, can I go and observe? And, the clerk basically said, no, that's not your job. You don't have anything to do with day to day, the actual operation of the election, the conducting of the election, because if something were to go wrong, a registrar really sits in judgment of how you remedy whatever goes wrong. So you kind of tainted if you actually have a hands-on piece with the election. So you have to stay detached. So, I mean, I think that's a brief description of how that tends to, how that works. So,
Okay.
yeah, so, and specifically for us, so we did have an incident where we got called in after an election. There was an issue with ballots that got stuck in one of the machines, and as a result of that, the total tally was off. And so the registrars had to sit and kind of observe how the clerk and her staff and the election workers were going to remedy that. And we observed that and make sure that it's on the up and up. So, it was, if I had been at that election, I would be tainted. I would have, whatever problem occurred there, perhaps, it could be said, well, you were part of that problem, so you can't really weigh in as an impartial judge, let's say. So, that was just one example of how that worked.
Oh, that's, it's funny because when you said that, it actually made sense. Like I initially thought like, hey, you'd have to be there to make sure everything, goes well or looks good and gives the visibility to people that things are going well. But when you explain it to us, I'm like, that makes more sense because you want to be impartial. You want to be, when something goes wrong, let's pull in these impartial people that will sit there and make sure that everything went smooth, or if there was an error or something that needs to be fixed, that it wasn't screwed up before and you might have potentially been part of it, or they could say you were part of it. So I think that's pretty interesting. Now, really quick too, you said you're unenrolled, and we also discussed how sometimes Republican town committees or Democratic town committees or whatever actually maybe get to nominate somebody. Can you explain how that process is supposed to work, if you don't mind?
Yeah, I don't. The specifics is the dates. I probably won't get right, but so at some point towards the beginning of the year, either of those parties submit there's laws, right? So the registrar piece is pretty heavily regulated with Mass General Law, and so
Yes.
one of those laws talks about the town is supposed to send out a letter to the town committees and say, hey, if you have candidates you'd like to submit to be put in as a registrar, you send them in, and there's deadlines involved with regards to that. So it's, the law says 3 candidates, right? So the committees would submit those names of 3 candidates and get them to the town clerk, and they'd be available. So in our situation, I was appointed by the select board. So the town clerk would then turn over, and I believe for us it's a little bit convoluted, but I think the select board actually is the one supposed to send out the letter since they do the appointment in my town. It's not always the case. Like I know of at least one town that it's the town manager or the town administrator that does registrar appointments, but in our town it's the select board. So those letters go out. If the town's committees return candidates, they need to return 3. If they get that done, then really that's the list that the select board should go by, is the committee's list of what they send, as opposed to a random citizen asking to be put on that board. So that was my case, right? A year ago, I was just random, and neither of those committees apparently had submitted names of people. So as a result, that cleared the way for me to be appointed.
Well, I like that too, because again, we want people to trust the voting system. And how do you do that? Well, we could debate if we should be a 2-party or a 3-party system, if we should have more parties, but at least having the ability to have local committees say, hey, listen, this is the person we want us to represent us, because we know that they'll try doing the right things on both sides. I think that's something key. Now, another thing that we discussed earlier was the town clerk. Is the town clerk kind of in charge of the registrars, or do you work hand in hand with the registrars? How is that relationship? How is it supposed to work? And do you take responsibilities away, or You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It seems like the town clerk is the main person that you all work or help out during this process.
Correct. The town clerk is the main head of all election pieces with regards to she goes from covering election workers, right? That's her responsibility too. She's in charge, completely in charge of the election piece. So with regards to us, in Massachusetts, it's a 4-member board. The town clerk is by default one of those members. And then the 3 other members of the board are appointed by the select board. So it's curious for us, or in my situation, you come on board and you're new and you're trying to follow along, and the town clerk has a pretty good handle on everything that's going on, and eventually you start to learn that if you educate yourself and you start to read about the laws, you understand the history of the registrars really was they were much more hands-on, but now in more modern times it's turned more into like a rubber stamp, and actually they basically create a stamp for you with my signature, and it has to be stamped on some of the documents, that the official documents with regards to elections. But for the most part, we don't have much to do with that. We forego the ability to have a hands-on day-to-day type of stuff with it and say, yeah, we believe you'll be doing the right thing, and if she needs to notify us about something, she will do that. But there's a lot of rubber stamping this job has transitioned into as far as being a registrar. So the registrars determine that. The town of Grafton select board, they wanted to have in-person early voting, but that had to come through the registrars. They can't just say, okay, this is what we want to do. We had to vote on that and make a vote. So that was one of the good things that we get to do. So things like that will crop up. This other piece about overseeing a recount, right? So that was one of them.
Yes.
As far as your relationship, you understand that the town clerk is the head of all election pieces. She's the chief election officer. However, you have the ability as someone on a board to make suggestions, make policy suggestions, and hopefully you have a clerk that listens to those types of things. And my clerk has done that with me, certainly. So that's been good.
You say something interesting too, because I think in a town that I'm associated with, their board of selectmen actually, from what I understand, they were telling me their board of selectmen were the people who decided whether to have early voting or not. And, when you sit there and say that the registrars are supposed to do it, I kind of wonder sometimes in politics, because there's a lot of mechanisms in place, but not all politicians know the laws or follow the laws. Like I said, because some are new, some just never had to go through it before. So when certain things are presented, that sometimes, they overstep their bounds. So I'm gonna probably have to look into that more and be like, hey, was a registrar supposed to do that, not the board of selectmen?
Yeah, but so some, and again, I think this is to the point of like it can be so. It's that may have happened in this case, and people are like, oh yeah, that was part of it, but the registrars are kind of not really looked at as an important position, so it kind of turns into maybe they had that conversation. It's because the select board is involved. It would be much easier, certainly in a town of that has politicians, select board members. They want to get out in front and say, hey, this is what we do, as opposed to registrars, which are typically just citizens of the town. They don't. For me, I don't have that political element, so it's easy maybe to just make it seem as though, even though there was more stuff going on behind the scenes and that registrars were involved in that decision, the select board saying, hey, look at us, that was kind of what we faced with our board, because in the end we voted against it to have early in person for many reasons, but the select board were in favor of it, and that was part of the politician piece. Every politician wants to go out and say, hey, I'm all for whatever voting we have. But
Yes.
the registrar's job really was to take for us, it was an assessment of cost. More importantly, it was an assessment of staff and how many election workers were going to be there. And we looked at a little bit of the past of the history of early in-person voting and whether it was really cost-benefit analysis, a value. And in this particular case, the board decided it was not for this particular election, right? This should come up again and we'll look at it again with maybe more information and maybe more feedback from the select board if that's the case. So that's how that really worked. We're separate. It's like separation of powers a little bit. It's just like we're not going to do it just because politically it's expedient. We're going to take a little bit of a harder look at it and try to come up with a more thorough decision.
So just going back, so anyone that's watching this right now and that's interested in becoming a registrar, can you kind of explain the process a little bit? So you mentioned that there's 4 registrars in town, and I think usually in a well-run town, they usually expire every year or so, so that one registrar rotates in and out every year. Some towns, I think they align all the expiration dates the same, but can you go over the dynamics around that? So like what someone that's interested in becoming a registrar, what would they look at, and like how would they get involved with that process?
So it seems like what's happening now is a lot of towns, from what I gather, their expiration term, your terms are 3 years. The town clerk is by default, as I said, a registrar, right? So that's typically your 3 citizens that are going to be registrars. They try to stagger your term so that with 3 registrars with 3-year terms, every year, typically one registrar would be coming up for reappointment. Um, so then it turns into for me it was okay. I got appointed like maybe in March. In that June 30th, that seems to be the date that towns are using now. June 30th is the expiration. My term expired. Select board appointed me in March. My appointment expired that June. And I really, for our town, I'm not so sure how it works for others, but I assume it's the same. I just submitted a letter for reappointment, and there was no other person that wanted to do it. So again, by default, I was able to take the next 3-year term, right? So my term now expires in 2 years. This year, our town is a little bit different. Something happened where, although in a lot of towns it's one every year, in our town we have 2 that are coming up for expiration this year. So one of those seats is actually open because the registrar resigned, and the other seat is just coming up by expiration. If nobody in the town asks to be a registrar, then again, if the person that's currently a registrar puts in a letter to say, yes, I'd like reappointment, he'll be reappointed by default. They're going to have to deal with the open spot. And so arguably, unless the committees, and I don't know, I'm not sure if the committees have names in the hat right now so that that select board can pick from them, but it could be just someone randomly, and you don't have to be involved with your town committee, right? You could have been like, so say for my case, if I wasn't unenrolled and I was a registered Republican, and I was the only one to do it, I think I would have been appointed. I'm just a citizen. I'm not on I wasn't a name forwarded by the town committee, but people have political affiliations, just regular citizens. So I probably would have got that appointment anyway. What
So I think we also discussed. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Is that you can't have. No, what you can't do is you can't overload a board, right? So really, on a 4-member board, you can't have more than 3 people. You can't have 3. You can have 2 of the same political affiliation, but you can't have more than 2. That way, so there is this, much like it is for election workers, which I think people don't necessarily realize either. The town clerk tries to balance that too. When you go in to vote and you go to a table and you check in, arguably you typically see 2 people sitting there. One of them they shouldn't be of the same party. They should be of different parties, right? So one should be a Republican. It's the same idea. It's checks and balances. Yeah. Same idea for the registrars, checks and balances. You'd like to have a registrar that's a Republican or a Democrat, vice versa. Ideally, if you had 4, 2 and 2 would be optimal. What you can't do is have 3. You couldn't have like 3 Republicans or 3 Democrats and 1 unenrolled, or 1 of the other, or 4 for that matter. So the select board would be limited in who they could appoint based on what the makeup is of the board as it stands.
Well, the other thing we discussed too, and correct me if I'm wrong, is if you served on an RTC, like if you were a chairman or in a finance, you're precluded from being a registrar. They won't let you. You kind of have to. You can still be a Republican, a registered Republican, but you can't hold a political position in town. Am I correct in saying that?
That's correct. I think the terminology is on the executive board of one of those town committees, right? So you're on the executive board, you're out. One of the other interesting that came up too with regards to regulations, and these are all in the law. I know people you just got to kind of, it's crazy, right? Because a lot of the other committees or boards, it wouldn't have this type of regulation, but it does for registrars. So yeah, I'm trying to think of the other piece would be you need to be, so for a Republican or a Democrat to be considered under the umbrella of their RTC, putting their names forward, they have to be enrolled in that party for at least 2 years.
Oh yeah, that's
So,
right.
you run into a thing where somebody newly appointed as a new enrollee to the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, if it's less than 2 years, they can't be considered under that umbrella of it's a town committee appointment.
Now, sorry for cutting you off, but does that go for, so that's Republican town committee, but does that go for, let's say, I was unaffiliated with anything. I just 6 months ago became a Republican. I'm not in the RTC. No one's running for it and is an open Republican. Could I do it in that capacity, or you had to have it for 2 years
I
before
don't
you had
think
to
you
be
could,
registered?
to be honest. I think that would still disallow you. You'd have to,
Yeah.
I don't think it matters if it's under that umbrella. It's a good question,
I
but I
think
don't
I
think it
think it
matters.
makes sense, right? Because I think maybe if you're in a political party and you're like, hey, we know this is coming up and no one's running, hey,
Right,
you go change your political affiliation to say you're a Democrat or say you're a Republican, and then
right,
when you get in there,
right.
no,
Yeah,
so
that has to
it
be
makes
true.
sense.
So would it make a difference so I misspoke. It wouldn't make a difference if it's whatever the town committee, that wouldn't matter. They're going to look at that and say, nope, not 2 years. You can't do it.
Right. So again, I have the voters' duties up, or the registrar voters' duties up,
Yeah,
and I'm just gonna ask you really quick if
sure.
you've done some things. So I'll ask you, have you done it? You say yes or no, and if you have and you want to discuss it a little more, just let me know. So, have you processed absentee voter applications?
No.
No. So again, I think some of these things on this list probably is the town clerk, because I know when I've dealt with the town clerks, they do a lot of this. So I'm sure some of these things you don't technically have to do. So, but for people interested, if they go see this list and like, I don't want to be processing absentee, you know what I mean? I just want to make them sure they kind of know what they might be getting into.
Or vice versa, Justin, right? So when I read all those things, I was like, oh, great, I'm going to do this, that, the other. It's really not true. So, it works both ways. I felt like, hey, I'd like to be involved in registering voters. I mean, it can happen, right? So this is the give and take it can happen. Now, if I pushed it and said, hey, by law, this is one of my duties and I should be able to do it.
Yes.
There's if people want to look at a very interesting case that happened in Amherst a couple of years ago, it was kind of like that, where the registrars there were basically trying to say we should be able to act independently. And so it's a funny dynamic that the town council weighed in. It's a good story. It's a good little story about trying to see how that all works with the relationships with registrars, and perhaps maybe they have more powers than you would think. So this rubber stamp piece that I talk about, right? So that was
Correct.
one of the arguments out in Amherst, was that because the registrars allowed the clerk gave them permission to use their stamp, they basically forfeited, I guess, for lack of a better term, any type of claim that they should be able to do those things after, when all said and done. It was curious, but so that type of stuff happens.
You brought up an interesting point too, where depending on the town clerk and the registrar and what sort of relationship there are ways that the registrar, there are things that the registrar can do to potentially become more involved in the process. And I think you were talking a little bit about your background, how you started off pretty much brand new, not knowing anything, and you were just kind of like listening in for a little bit. But then as time went on, you found ways to become a little bit more involved in the process. Could you walk through that a little bit?
Yeah, so for that piece, it's, as Justin brought up earlier, you feel out your relationship with your clerk, and to see how it is, what some of the things she'd be receptive, she or he would be receptive to. So for me, it kind of worked out into suggesting things for our agenda. Right, so just like all your other town committees or boards, you submit an agenda 48 hours before you actually have the meeting. Usually your board or committee members will get a copy of it prior to it being posted. It needs to be posted, right? So for us, we post it on the town website, and we would get a copy ahead of time. And so for me, my clerk was very good about, I would say, hey, could we talk about this, and this? Some of those things were things I personally observed at polls, per se, let's say, or some of it was just stuff that I knew that, I wanted the people of the town to understand these are the things we do. Otherwise, it's just kind of a skeleton agenda, right? So, and my town clerk was great. She'd be like, "Yep, okay." She'd say, "If you have any suggestions," but that was like a process, It wasn't like my first. So let's say my first meeting, there was an email that went out and said, "Hey, if you people have any, if you registrars have have any things you'd like to see on the agenda, please send me an email. That was kind of like me saying, hey, can we do this? So but since that first time, then it's been like a common thing where it's been allowed. So that's one example of how, you as a registrar can influence what goes on with what the clerk puts out for an agenda.
Now, we're peppering you with a lot of questions, and like I said, you're providing a lot of information, so thank you very much. So again, to kind of piggyback off of what Jim was asking too, typical duties that you have to do, like how much time do you invest? Are there meetings? Is there like a workload? I know you said you've done your own research on the laws and trying to figure out what you have to do. I think understandably a lot of people in any new job understand that's going to be an undertaking, but what are the typical duties that you have? And like I said, are there meetings? Do you have to go deal with the Board of Selectmen or the Select Committee often? Can you just give a little bit on that, please?
Does the state provide any training materials too? That's another question that goes with that.
So I've had some questions with regards to some of the things. So one of the state is the Division of Elections out of the Attorney General's office. So they typically do stuff through email. So if I've had some questions, and my clerk even says, look, if you still have, if you have a problem, an issue with whether it's her view of something or, contact them. So she pointed out that was my contact point with regards to those questions. And I'm sorry, go ahead. I jumped over to Jimmy's
typical
thing.
Duties, like typical duties, your workload, like.
Yeah, so the workload.
Are there meetings you have to attend?
Yep, the meeting piece is really, I mean, I guess it's kind of the clerk determines when we need to meet. Like, so one of the things was in town, they won they were awarded some money with regards to using it to go towards promoting elections in town, right? So that was an agenda item that the clerk wanted to talk to the registrars to see if we had any ideas about that. So I think depending on how active your clerk is and how active your registrars want to be, she could have meetings frequently, but for the most part, I think on average we have two. It's almost, there's going to be like mandatory meetings. So registrars are responsible to count overseas ballots. So that's one of the things that we would meet. Sometimes you don't get them, but you'll get that has a lot to do with the military piece, right? So when those ballots come in, then if they're not in by the day of the election, I think you have some leeway. It could be like a week after. So the clerk schedules a meeting to say, hey, if we get any of these ballots, you folks got to come in and we got to count these ballots. So this fall, we didn't have that. She didn't receive any of those ballots. So we didn't have to have that meeting, but it got posted as a meeting and like I say, but it wasn't necessary to have it. So those are the things that come up. Again, so this particular year, it turned into, we had to have a meeting to decide if the registrars wanted to have in-person early voting, right? So I'm still learning about some of the reasons we have meetings. But, again, we go back to really the clerk and her staff or his staff are really the ones that are doing the day-to-day hands-on stuff. And it's almost like, well, we're all set. And I imagine it's different for every clerk. Some clerks maybe want more involvement from their registrars, but certainly it doesn't have to be that way. It can be, hey, I mean, all you got to do, I suggest people go to their own town websites and look at your minutes and agenda and see, that's a good learning tool for anyone that wants to start out as a registrar. If you're interested, go to your town website, look at the agendas and the minutes and read some of the things they do. In my case, it was a little bit difficult because I think the less the better was the mentality, I think, where I am, right? It was kind of like, okay, we'll do the basic things we need to do, but for the most part, the registrars can, and maybe the registrars prior to me, that's what they wanted. They didn't want to be so involved. Like they made it clear. So it's like, hey, look, the less meetings, the better. So that might have been the case. I was kind of had a different attitude about it. So it's like, no, let's have six. Let's have a meeting a month. If she said, I would have said, oh, great. And maybe we don't have much to talk about, but maybe we do. So that's kind of it. That's how that goes.
Thanks for providing the insight. I think, we talk about there's always a lot more ways to get involved than just voting. I think a lot of people, it's a shock when we tell that to people because obviously everyone puts on that sticker, I voted, and that's like kind of the way that they get involved. But then there's a lot of other ways that people can get involved, whether it's joining your local town committee, whether it's the DTC or the RTC. And getting involved in just local election stuff as well, whether it's an elected position or, something that gets appointed by the select board. there's so many other ways to get involved, and we encourage it. We recommend that to as many people that watch this and that follow politics or just want to change the direction in Massachusetts as much as possible. It's like you got to learn about the different positions and find a way to get involved other than just voting.
And the other piece, the thing that goes hand in glove, kind of with the registrar piece, and as a matter of fact, my clerk and I had a conversation that she felt maybe I'd be I wanted to be a poll worker, right? So you can talk about poll workers. You have wardens and you have clerks, right? Yep. So we have, in my time, we have 5 precincts. So we have 5 wardens, and then you have 5 clerks. And so the warden oversees what goes in that precinct. Really, the clerk isn't down on the floor either. She's at her office, and there'll be communication. So let's say you had a voter that came in and they didn't have them on the voting rolls. There'd be a conversation. The warden would step in. They fill out affidavits depending on the situation. Then the warden would try to either confirm that this was a registered voter that just didn't happen to be on the list by maybe a mistake, or so forth and so on. And so you also have with the wardens their clerks, and a clerk is really supposed to take note of everything that occurs. So you have, let's say you had a voter that came in and wasn't on the rolls, and now the warden steps in and says, look, we're going to try to straighten this out. We want you to vote. That and really they err on the side of people voting all the time. But now the clerk needs to make note of all the little things that go on. And then the people at the tables, when you check in, a lot of times they'll call them inspectors. And so, they're going to ask you your name and your address. And so then they'll check you in to vote and give you your ballot. And then after the elections, I know the terminology that's on our website is tellers. So maybe people that weren't involved in the people voting, but now they're going to come in and work on the counting of ballots. So like you say, Jim, it's just like, would that have been better for me? I kind of like registrar. I like to figure it out. I think I could be a poll worker, but sure, go out there, be a poll worker, start there. As someone that wants to get involved in the process. I mean, I know for me, even just being a registrar, I became much more confident. I know there's election issues around the country, but I became much more confident in how my town does it and really how the state does it. It's pretty impressive. It's really well regulated. Believe me, I was like, okay, I was skeptical, but nope, I've come around to understand that Massachusetts does a good job. They, from what I can see in my involvement in it, they really do a good job, and my town does too. So.
And I think that's an important point to note too, because that's one thing that's always been murky to me is like understanding that process. Like I want to understand what the chain of custody is on election day. Like I want to know where do those mail-in ballots go? Like when they get put in the drop box and they stay in there, and then who has access to take those out of the drop box? Who's watching them do that? Like those are things I think every town should really be making as transparent as possible, because we're at a stage in this country where it's like, we need to remove all doubt of any sort of shenanigans going on in the election process, and just having that all open to the public and just like having as many people involved in that, I think is going to build a lot more trust in the public and accepting elections. And we talked about in Massachusetts too, even if you have everything transparent. I mean, we talk about, some of the elections, like when Justin ran for office, we were waiting for the town to post the official election results for over a month after the election happened. And that's because some of the laws in Massachusetts, I think it has to be postmarked by a certain date. But if the mail comes in after it was postmarked, so it might take it a week or 2 weeks to come in, as long as it was postmarked by election day, then you're still allowed to count it. So, there's so many different variables that go into people not wanting to trust the election process. So I think as much transparency and as much people, as many people that can get involved as possible will help alleviate some of the concerns people have around the election process.
Absolutely. Justin asked me earlier too about training. So this year, my first year, I had got appointed before I could go to the training session for poll workers. But this year I was able to go. So someone from the state came and they talked about, some of the machines that each town uses and in the training piece with regards to that. But in that training too, I learned that, you can go to your polls early and watch to see, you can be an observer if you have concerns about how that works. I know, Jimmy, you talked about, wardens have a lot to do with when you talk about those ballots getting moved from A to B, wardens have a lot to do with that. So, right. So and it's a good question. I can tell you that as a registrar, I didn't oversee. So let's say, for example, you're going to have early mail-in vote, right? They're going to go to the clerk's office, and at some point those ballots have to be transferred because they're going to be counted on election day. at the polls, at the precincts. So I don't know who, it's a fair question. And even as a registrar, I don't know who does that, right? So, you're relying on your town clerk to make sure that those decisions are handled correctly. And again, go into the polls early, see how they set up when what they call zero the machines, right? To make sure that there's the voting machines, the tabulators that are used don't have numbers on them already. They run a tape that says zero, so you can see that and you can watch them. It's same thing at close of ballots. They have to run the tape again. You have a right to be there to watch what they do, right? So, and again, right, so that's part of the election piece. I vote. The only, as a registrar, I went and voted, but I'm not there in any type of administrative capacity. But as an observer, you can watch those types of things. You're allowed. You have a right to do those types of stuff. I just don't know. I've never heard anyone tell me a story. It's like, hey, I went to my polling place a half an hour early before them so I could see the zero tapes. You know what I mean? There's things that people can do if you're skeptical or you want to learn more, or you want to see things. One of the things that came up for us too was they test the machines prior to elections, and I didn't necessarily get invited to that, where it wasn't like an email. We go back to the communication piece. We're gonna do the tests of the ballot box, a week before. Well, that wasn't really. I didn't get asked to go to do that. The poll training this year was something that came up, and I said, hey, can the registrars go to this training? My clerk said, absolutely. But I'm not so sure that would have been initiated by anyone in the clerk's office if you didn't ask. So I think I'm learning some of the things to say, yeah, you can be involved. You just got to be read a little bit and learn a little bit and try to understand. So,
well, again, like what I like is, and I think Jim alluded to it a little bit earlier, is you're doing something. You're retired, and you said you wanted to do something. And a lot of people, it's when we do this show and people talk to us about it, I think they always think doing something is something super great. And I'm not saying what you're doing is not great, because trust me, it sounds pretty cool. I'm actually interested, and I kind of like hit myself that I didn't understand what you do. But what I try telling people is doing nothing isn't the option, right? If
I agree.
If you want things to be better, there's something you can do. And whether it's becoming a registrar, running for an office, helping people out, working on a poll, working the polls, right, on election day, there's always something you can do, right? Just do something, go out and look for it. And I think what happens is if more people do that and more people understand what's going on, how their government works, obviously that knowledge spreads. And when that knowledge spreads, like you both hinted to earlier, is the more people know about things, the more confident you feel that things are either going well, or if you don't have that confidence, then you can bring those issues up and try fixing things. So I think we can all sit there and say, hey, listen, our voice is being heard, and maybe our side is doing a bad job of messaging, and that's why we're not winning, and maybe we just need to do better. But at least we can be confident that when we go to vote, our voices are being heard. And like I said, I appreciate, I know I appreciate everyone that does anything. When I was running for office, people used to say, thank you for running. I'm like, no, thank you for being here, because even just showing up to help somebody, or showing up to be a registrar, or showing up to work a poll, that's a lot, because a lot of people don't want to give up their time to do it, but they sit there and they claim like, oh, everything's crappy, everything's bad. And I'm like, well, what are you doing? Right? Do something.
Right.
And like, well, what should I do? I'm like, it's not up for me, because I don't want to tell you. I don't know what you're interested in. I don't know what your time frame is. I don't know what abilities you have. It's up to you to sit there and like, what can I give? Because giving nothing shouldn't be the option.
Yeah, I agree. So I think what I don't see is younger people kind of being involved as poll workers or even registrars. That'd be nice to see. I realize it's difficult, with people working and so forth and so on, but seeing younger people come to the polls. The other piece is in being workers is that I don't think I'm going to go any further than the registrar. But however, what it does do is it allows you the opportunity to see how boards work and to the different rules and making motions. And I mean, you can watch it on TV, but until you're actually doing it, it's, I fumbled through all sorts of stuff, and it's funny, you watch it on TV and go, this is easy, until you're actually needing to make a motion or take a vote, or make a motion to adjourn, anything. It gets funny when it's in there, but it gives you, I think the registrar piece is good with regard to that, because there's not too many meetings. It's just like if we had 4 a year, I'd say that would be a lot, unless something happens at the election where as a result of that you have to weigh in on some sort of thing, but those things don't happen frequently, I don't believe. And so it gives you the sense of, you can be part of a board and see how it works. If you then want to move on to something that's a busier board, things that meet more frequently that you're interested in. So I think it's a good stepping stone for that. My clerk even said as much. She goes, this is a good board to start with if you had thoughts of moving on to other boards, whether it be select board or, any of the boards in the town.
Awesome. Well, Dan, I appreciate you coming on our show. I appreciate you explaining what the registrars of voters does in Massachusetts. I'm sure we'll probably have to have you on again in the future when you get a little bit more. And I'm sure if the next election people have questions or they're like, hey, I'd love to ask that guy Dan about this or that or how I get involved or whatever. So, if they want to reach out, we can always shoot you an email and say, what's this? Or if they're interested. But, I just want to take a second to say thank you for doing this. I appreciate the time spending with us and also the time you're taking to do something outside of the norm, right? Doing something that you're participating, because we need, like I said, we need more people like you who are willing to step up and do something. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Is that you're too kind? It's really, you know what I mean? Again, it's not really it's I love doing it. Absolutely. I know for me it was difficult at first because, my feeling was my clerk's busy and the other registrars are busy and they have lives. And so it was difficult to really get a good idea of what this was. I will talk to anybody about being a registrar. I love it. I think it's, it's interesting. I'm happy they can call me all day long. I'm happy to talk to them about it because I do think it's important. It's they're
gonna run away from you. He's gonna talk to us about being a registrar.
Nuts, I know. It's crazy, but yeah. I love it. It's great. Happy to do it.
We need people excited like that. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Dan. You have a wonderful day. Thank you.
You too. Bye, Justin. Thank you.